It is a bit silly. Also, I mean, you can't always choose when your classes are going. Some classes are like there's one time slot and that's all you get.
Yeah, and you know what's worse? The
Hmm.
class I have right now is for 2 semester.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it was from last semester all the way through here, which is why my Tuesday is still not available.
Okay, gotcha. All right, Cody, can you
And
talk real quick?
I am here. I am here. I'm working.
All
I'm
right,
checking
we
it
hear
out.
you. So in that case, I think that we're ready to get started. Uh, Bernard can join a little bit late. That's all right. We're already behind schedule, so I'll get started now. Oh, that's funny. I see my pen twice. Doesn't really matter. This example is just gonna probably be a stationary screenshot to explain something. But all right, today we are going to be talking about creating your own fight strategies, right? In the past, I've given you guys some fight strategies for here's what you do in this map. On the screen here, we have our Ramatra Lifeweaver strategy on Dorado First Point. But it's really important to be able to make your own strategies. Sometimes you're making whole team strategies, like this one here, where you have like the whole team organized on what they're doing, and that's mainly what we'll be focusing on. But a lot of the times, for your own personal use, you'll be making individual or maybe like two-person strategies. Um, and that's how you'll mainly be using this. All the same principles will apply, but we're going to focus on the slightly more involved and in-depth whole team strategies, just because there's more to dig into there, and I want you guys to have a full understanding of the concept. So to get started, I'm just going to define what fight strategies even are. Like, what does this process consist of? So the thing is that a fight strategy is for a specific point, right? So a fight strategy isn't like for the whole map, it's for a specific point. Like here, we have Dorado first point, even more specifically, Dorado first point, first fight, because a lot of points will have multiple different fights where the position can happen. And so fighting here versus fighting where the payload's at the end of the point is going to be a different fight. But then once you know where the fight's going to be, what the strategy actually consists of is going to be what characters you're going to play, where those characters are going to be, what their goal is to achieve in those positions, and how you're going to respond to the enemy's responses. And so to start to dig into this a little bit, we're going to talk about characters. So within any fight strategy, there are two types of characters that you need to keep in mind. There are mandatory characters and there are flexible characters. Does anyone have any ideas of what a mandatory character versus a flexible character might mean?
one put out more damage than the other.
More damage than the other? Maybe sometimes, but no. No, think broad context of what like the definition would be of a mandatory character versus a flexible character in the context of a fight strategy. That's all right. I will explain. So, a mandatory character is one that cannot be replaced for another character for the strategy to function properly, meaning that there's no other character in the game that can fill that character's role within the strategy. A flexible
Yeah.
character is one that can be effectively swapped for one or more other characters with little to no effect on how effective the strategy is. Now, typically, a fight strategy will only really have one or maybe two mandatory characters, and the rest tend to be flexible. And for my example here, is on this Dorado defense strategy. Everyone should be familiar with this. We talk about it enough. David, you haven't really played it since you don't play in JV, but everyone else should be able to help me here. Um, who do you guys think are the mandatory characters versus the flexible characters in this strategy?
Life Weaver,
What is Lifeweaver?
um, mandatory.
Yes, Lifeweaver is a mandatory character. He is the most mandatory character. The strategy entirely revolves around this pedal, so the ram can drop back, and also the pull, be able to save danger. Yeah, Weaver is the most mandatory character. There is one other mandatory character, in my opinion. It's kind of arguable. There's one other mandatory character in this strategy. Who do you guys think that is?
I'm thinking it's the Ram.
That would be correct. Ram is the best tank to do in the strategy. You could, in theory, make it try and function with an Orisa or with a Zarya or with any other brawl tank, but they're all going to be
Reinhardt.
Reinhardt, yeah, but they're all going to have significant um, drops in effectiveness compared to the Ramatra. And so even though the strategy technically functions, it functions at significantly less effectiveness. That, in my opinion, the Ramatra is a mandatory character for the strategy. So these two are mandatory, which means that the other characters, the Lucio, you can't really see him, but there's a Lucio over here. This Bastion, we wouldn't usually run Bastion. This is just how it was in this example. Usually we would run a Torb here or Cassidy. But that's flexible. The Reaper is flexible, right? Because each of these people don't fill a super important role. The Lucio's job is to lock down this high ground. A Brig can do that just as well. The Torb slash Cassidy slash Bastion's job is to protect the Lifeweaver. Well, those are already 3 characters who do that, and there are even more who could do it. You could do it with a Hanzo. You could do it with a maybe even a Venture. There's a lot of guys that can do it. The Reaper's job is just to play either on this angle or on this angle and push in with the Ram. Any other flex DPS can do that. So, does the idea of mandatory and flexible characters make sense to everybody? Is that all making sense? Any questions? All right, not hearing any questions, so I will move on to the next thing. So once you know what the characters you're going to be playing in a strategy are, I can erase these notes here. Once you know what characters you're going to be playing in a strategy, the next thing to decide is what positions you're going to be playing, right? The core basis of any fight strategy is what positions are going to be played by who. Like, if you just want to really quickly make a fight strategy, that's what you got to figure out. Who's going to go where? But yeah, I want you to dig a little bit deeper than that. And so, I'm going to ask a little bit of a tricky question here. What do you guys think the primary goal of any fight strategy is?
Wait,
Space? Hey, he got it. He knows me. I love space. Yes, the primary goal of any fight strategy is to play the positions that give your team the greatest space advantage possible. And real quick, we've already talked about this before in my first lecture. Can somebody remind me of some of the ideas or some of the factors that go into a position being a strong and key position? What makes a position good?
high reward, low list.
What was that?
Yeah, high reward and low risk factor.
Did you say a high versus a low risk factor?
Yeah,
Oh, okay. That's a bit broad. I want specific examples that we can point to and say, this position has this benefit. This position has that benefit. There's a list of these that we talked about before in my space lecture. And I've talked about again in other times. Can anybody name some of these? A couple of them are really easy.
It plays to your range.
Plays to your effective range. Yes, so proximity is what that would be. Specifically proximity to backline usually. That's a good one. Is there anything else? You're seeing a whole lot of one of this on this map here, right? What does this position provide these people? Like, what's the most
base
obvious?
line.
High ground. Yep, it controls high ground. And also, along with that, this position, because the backline is going to be located around over here, these players have the option to drop over the wall onto the backline. So it gives a strong angle onto the backline. Other advantages of a position are cover, having control of the objective, and health packs. Health packs are kind of niche. They're not super important. You can mostly ignore them. But high ground, cover, angles, proximity to backline, those are the huge ones that you should always consider for what makes a space worth controlling. Right? So the reason I go over that is just so you're aware of, like, when you're making your fight strategies, to know, like, what position should I be looking at trying to control. And now another thing to keep in mind with positioning is that fight strategies benefit heavily from utilizing unorthodox positions. Because if an enemy is unfamiliar or surprised by something, they might not know how to adapt to it. If they've never had a team defend where you're defending, or they've never had a team attack where you're attacking, they'll probably be clueless for at least a fight or two until they figure it out, and that can be very strong. But keep in mind that you don't want to over-index on some niche position and end up fall victim to creating a gimmick strategy. And we'll talk more about gimmick strategies later, but just keep that in the back of your head right now. So, as an example of an unorthodox position, here, you can't see it currently. This is a video replay because I just want to be able to have this fight shown. But behind where the camera is, there's like a yellow building. Oops, let me get my pen here. That's gonna get confused because there's two different pens. But behind where the camera is, there's like a yellow building over here. And this is a super underutilized and unorthodox spot. And I love holding here as Winston. It's great because I can jump this high ground here after they evict it. That's an example of an unorthodox position because teams are not used to anyone ever playing there, right? No one uses that. But if you have a strategy built around it, you can use an unorthodox position to great effect, and the enemy team's unfamiliarity will be a huge bonus to your strategy's strength. Are there any questions about positions? All right, let's move on to goals. So I already said earlier, the overarching goal of any fight strategy is to gain a space advantage. There's a little bit more to that. So the whole definition is the overarching goals of any fight strategy is to gain a space advantage, leverage an already existing space advantage, or reduce a space disadvantage. All right. So if you're the attacking team here, right, for this team, they essentially have no hope of gaining a space advantage off rip because the space disadvantage that the space advantage that the defenders hold is so strong that no matter what these guys do, they can't erase it. All that they can play to do is to lessen our advantage, to try and kick us off of this high ground, to try and push us back to this high ground, and then maybe they can wrap around and now they might start having an advantage. But it's going to take a lot of steps for them to get there. So for these guys, they're mainly worried about lessening the disadvantage they have. For our side, though, on the defense, we already have an advantage, so we're trying to play to leverage that advantage to make it as oppressive as possible. You want to not let the enemy team have a single inch to breathe on. But that's the overarching goal. That's what the whole strategy tries to achieve. But every individual character will have specific goals that they have to uphold for the strategy to work. So I have a list of a few of these goals, but let's just get a simple example here. I'll ask some questions. So in this strategy, right on our screen that we talked about a little bit before, what is the Life Weaver's goal? Make sure it's a different color. What is the Life Weaver's goal in this strategy?
Transport the team.
Transport the team. Yes. Yes, that is one of the things here. Use cooldowns to move teammates to new positions. Good examples of this are the pedal or the pull that Weaver has, but also things like speed boost. So if you've ever seen a Lucio ran in a strategy, most of the time his purpose is to move his teammates around. And yeah, that's a big thing. That's Weaver's main goal here. So not Weaver anymore, but what is the Ramatra's goal in this strategy? He has a couple here. He has a couple goals. What's one of his big goals?
Beat people up.
Beat people up? Can you be a little bit more specific about that?
Take space. Take closer space.
Hmm.
What's
Yeah.
the word? To put more disadvantage to enemy, I guess.
Yeah, I'll give you guys a couple different examples because his goal really varies on what the enemy team does. So I'm going to give you guys scenario one. All right, scenario one is the attacking team tries to jump on this high ground. What is the Ramatra's goal?
Push him off.
Push them off. Yes, yes. Force enemies off of positions or force enemies out of a position. That is one of his main goals here. Another big goal that he might have is, let's say that the attacking team doesn't push up here. If they instead try and push through here, what is the Ramatra's goal then? What does he now, if the tank is here, right? Let's say that the tank is playing here. What does this Ramatra now have access to?
Well, he can easily poke from there for sure.
He can poke, but what can he poke at specifically? What's going to be around here?
Payload and supports, probably.
Supports backline. Backline is the keyword I'm looking for. He gets access to pressure the backline. Should the Ramatra drop on their head? Maybe sometimes, but probably he stands there and he pokes. I don't know if his punches can reach from there or not, but mainly he's there to pressure the backline. Same thing with the Reaper, right? If they push through this way. There are a couple other important strategies here, or important goals within a strategy. So some of the main ones haven't covered here, but a few other ideas to keep in mind is forcing point can be a common goal. Now in this position, that's not realistically going to happen, but a lot of times, like a good example is on like Eichenwald first point. If like a Sombra goes around and TPs onto the point, her job is to force point, to force the enemies to drop back to deal with her and kick her off the payload or kick her off the capture point. Another option is to draw attention to an angle. You could argue that forcing point is just a subcategory of this, but I think they're different enough to call them different names. But drawing attention to an angle. So this is like the idea of a soft dive. If you remember in our space lecture, we talked about that, is where you jump to a position, specifically like a vulnerable position, to hope that more people from the enemy team will be drawn towards you away from their good positions. Pressuring backline, already talked about that a little bit, right? If you pressure backline, it is also attached to drawing people to an angle. A lot of these coincide with each other, but you can force attention backwards to protect those people. You can also force out cooldowns and take their attention away from where they might need to help their tank. You can also lock down a position. So in this strategy on our screen here, right, the Lucio's main job here is to make certain that the enemy team cannot gain access to this high ground. He wants to lock this down, boop off anyone who comes up here, fight them away, so that way the Ramatra is going to have a safe avenue to retreat to if he gets in danger. So the Lucio's main job in this position is just to lock down this high ground. Another one is to push in on space that teammates make. So a good example of that one is if you guys remember the around the wall strat on Eichenwald, right? The people who are staying in main who aren't going around the wall, their job is once the tank lands behind the wall and he draws a ton of space back towards him, their job is to push in on the space that the tank makes and to close the gap and compress the enemy team on the point. Force enemies out of position. We already talked about that. You know, the Ramatra, if they push up here, the Ramatra forces them out. That one's the simplest to understand, to be honest. And then also using cooldowns to move your teammates, like what the Life Weaver does in this strategy. Now, goals are not things like capture the point or get picks, right? Because those are too unspecific and really obvious, right? Of course, that's the goal. Of course, the goal is to win the game. The goals in the context of fight strategies are the specific things that each character is responsible for taking care of to get to that goal. And another thing here is just a note to understand is that the goals that your characters are going to have in these strategies are just the things that's going to give your team advantages that they can then leverage to help them get those picks and to capture the point, right? I can't just say, well, Widowmaker, your job is to headshot their supports every single fight. Sure, it kind of
There.
is, right? But maybe you can't do that. Maybe the Widowmaker has to first take a powerful angle that's going to give her sightline onto the back line, and then she can attempt to get her picks. Or maybe first the Reaper has to push them out from cover, so then the Widowmaker can take the shot and then get the picks. Right? You have to first play to get the advantages to give yourself the setup to eventually get the picks and win the fight. Is everyone understanding goals? Goals are a really big one here, so if there's any questions, please feel free to ask.
My goal is to feed.
There could probably be a strat where tactical feeding is one of the goals.
Yeah,
Um,
wasting cooldown.
yeah. Maybe you can hold them in the spawn room and die for it. That could be a legitimate
That's
strat
also
potentially. All right, but I think that we're
like
good.
D1 feeder.
Yeah, I think we're good on goals. So I'm gonna move on to one of the biggest things you gotta keep in mind when you're making a strategy, which is accounting for enemy responses. All right. So I'll draw this visually here for you guys. So once you have this strategy set up here, right, the enemies are gonna have options of how they can respond to that. So let me draw this here. So we have the start of this is gonna be up here, right? This is step one. So this is us setting up like this. This is us doing this. But then after this, the enemy team is going to have multiple different options of how they can reply to it. There's like an infinite list of these. We're only going to talk about the two most likely options, right? So, what are two of the most likely options the enemy team can reply? Can somebody tell me one option of how they might reply to seeing us defending this way?
Uh,
Take
Some
our
type
high
of
ground.
dive or pincer of some sort.
Where? I want more specific than that. Where are they going to push? What are they going to try and do?
dude, it's always the far right first.
Go around far right. Yeah, sure. So I'll say I didn't give myself enough space to write, but I'm just gonna put an R for going around the right side. And then what's another option that they might do? But that doesn't have to be the best. Just like, what do you think a team is really likely to do in this situation? I already talked about it a little bit ago, and it's not
Go
even a good
left.
option. Left.
Go
I
high
mean,
Go
ground.
under. Yeah. Go
go
under
under.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
under's a really common one too. Going under here and then exposing their backline to our mantra. Or another third one, I'll put a third one here just to have it, is to go height, H. A lot of teams will try and push their mantra and Reaper off of high ground, even though this is a really losing battle for them, they will not evict them. Well,
Dude,
maybe. Depends on what their team is, but
I think another big one that we're gonna start seeing is SimTP.
SimTP, yeah, SimTP is we'll talk about that later. That would be under counterplay strategy, which is slightly different than this
Sim
actually.
is actually gonna be meta. I'm gonna lose my mind.
Could be, could be. But all right. But now for each of these responses that the enemy team has, our team now has multiple responses to pick from, right? We now get to pick responses to this and to this. And then they pick responses to those responses. And it's an endless chain until the fight is over, right? Typically, for a fight strategy, right, you can't go down those trees forever and figure out every single possible scenario. It's just not within the realm of limits. But what I do want to see is I want to see you guys find the two or three most common or most likely responses and then plan out. You don't got to plan out two, but if you guys could just plan out one good response, like what is the best response to this? What do we do if they push right? What do we do if they push the high ground? What do we do if they wrap underneath? That's where the planning can end. You can try and go further than that if you want, but it's kind of unlikely that you'll be able to account for everything then. There's so much variance past this point that I don't really think it's worthwhile. I think this is as far as you really have to go, is just account for the most probable responses and then have the correct response to those responses. Let me see my notes here, see if I'm missing anything. I'll be 1 second real quick. All right, sorry about that. I am back now, guys. Sorry, let me go through here. All right, so yeah, so good fight strategies are going to account for multiple responses, not just one. Don't just say they're most likely to go high ground. So what do they do then? Think about the other responses that they could do as well. And then even bad responses should be addressed, right? So in this strategy here, the enemy team going underneath and exposing their backline is a bad response most of the time. But you have to address it because even though it's a bad response, it might not be bad if you don't have a plan of how to punish it, right? So it's important to address any bad responses and have a plan for that. And then, yeah, for each of those probable responses, plan out an extra step. All right, I think that's everything here, and we'll touch on counterplay next. Before we go to talk about counterplay, does anyone have any questions on responses? Okay, no questions so far. So, counterplay is technically a type of response that the enemy can take, but I differentiate it a little bit. Because the difference is that a usual response is the enemy team walks out of the door, they see what they're doing, what are they going to do right away? Whereas counterplay options is they might lose a fight or two, and they might think, okay, what can we do to fix this? And then they'll start to employ these counterplay strategies. And those strategies are usually going to require very specific positioning or specific character swaps for them to work, which is why I separate them from regular responses. Because the enemy team effectively cannot do a counterplay strategy the first fight unless they somehow know you're going to do that strategy. Because they need to know ahead of time what the strategy is, and they need to switch to the characters to execute the counterplay. So what David was saying with the sim TP, yeah, a sim TP does cause problems to here. If you guys TP up to this position and then push through, or they haven't even pushed up to this position and push through, that could give us some trouble. Or if they TP back here, right, Cody's dead. That sucks. So sim TP is an effective counterplay to the strategy. It's going to take a lot of work from us to be able to figure that out, be able to play against that. But first fight, they realistically aren't going to be able to sim TP unless they plan on doing it anyways, which is just kind of luck based. So to get into counterplay a little bit more detail, right? Every strategy has multiple counterplay options. Multiple. Some will be stronger than others, but it's important to recognize all of the most dangerous ones. So in this strategy, SimTP is one dangerous counterplay. What is the most common counterplay strategy? And if anyone remembers, actually, it's the reason why we lose this point. Does anyone know what the most common counterplay to this strategy is?
They are better than us.
Well, a little bit more specific than that.
Uh, I don't know.
It's all right. So the answer is to dive the Light Weaver. All right, they're actually going to do it here. The Adventure's going to go behind, it's going to dive the Light Weaver, and we're going to kind of collapse because of it. Because we don't counter the counterplay properly. We'll talk about that a little bit. But yeah, diving Light Weaver is an excellent way to refute this strategy. Because he's so integral to keeping it up, and if you can kill the Light Weaver, the whole strategy kind of crumbles. But now, when you're making strategies, it is really vital to know ahead of time what the counterplay to your strategy is, right? You don't want to come up with this great strategy, and then when your Life Weaver gets dived, you're like, what do we do? You want to plan ahead and know that that's going to happen and have a plan for when the Life Weaver gets died, right? Our plan for when Life Weaver gets died is to have the Cassidy, Torbjorn / Bastion play here and fend off the diver with the Life Weaver. That's the plan. It's, yeah, like I was saying there. And that's countering the counterplay, effectively. Is the enemy team, right? If we remember our like little drawing here of we have our one option, which goes into the enemy team's option, and then what is our reply to that going to be, right? Countering the counterplay. That's what you want to be able to do. And now, you may find that when you're looking into this, that you'll realize that to a certain counterplay option, you don't have any counter to it. You don't have a defense. Your strategy just crawls apart. If that is the instance, that is a gimmick strategy. Now, gimmick strategies have a lot to talk about. So before I get into that, are there any questions about counterplay so far before we get into gimmicks? All right, don't hear any questions. So I'll talk about gimmick strategies then. So I already said earlier, gimmick strategies are essentially strategies that, when countered, no longer function. All right. So an example of a gimmick strategy would be, let's say that there was a Reinhardt on defense, that we were playing Reinhardt, and we were hiding like in this corner here by the spawn room. And then when they pushed out, pinned behind them, right? That will probably work once. Because if they don't know that you're there as Ryan, you can probably get the pin off and get a kill. But if they do know, they are just going to turn around and kill you here. So that's a gimmick strategy. Once they employ the counterplay of just kill you, it stops working. Now that one's a really cheesy gimmick strategy. There are other strategies that are more well-disguised gimmicks that you think work really well, but you'll find with one specific counterplay, they just crumble. But I'll talk about these a
That
little.
one play, the Kung Fu Pantera did it like 2016 with a
Say it
May. They
again?
just go. No, this is like so off topic, but there was a strategy, watch one on this map. It's on, I
Uh-huh.
think it was Kung Fu Pantera who did it.
Mhm.
They used May and Lucio to flip around the whole map.
Oh, really? Okay. Huh.
It
Oh
was
yeah,
like
they
over an
go
hour ago.
they go by the mega. That's like far right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. But all right. So gimmick strategies are not universally bad. Even though they're called gimmicks, gimmicks can be good sometimes. Um, it's good to have one in your back pocket, but it shouldn't be your main strategy, right? Maybe if you play Ryan Hart, maybe you do sit there once or twice and you go for the cheeky pin, but it probably shouldn't be your main strategy. You should have a real strategy to fall back on after the first time you try it, because they're only going to really work once or until they start employing counterplay. Gimmick strategies, yeah, they tend to work once when the enemy team is not prepared for it or hasn't had a chance to swap to the counters. Because counterplay requires hero swaps or specific strategy adjustment, right? It's very unlikely for them to do it the first time. So usually the first fight you try a gimmick, it'll probably work. Or at least give you a really good advantage that you can leverage to try to win. Obviously, just using strategy doesn't guarantee a win ever, but it can guarantee an advantage at least. Because of the huge advantages that a gimmick strategy can give you if they aren't countered, I would still say they're important to have in your back pocket. You just have to make sure that you have a real strategy to fall back on. You can't just stick with a gimmick strategy to the end. And by the nature of how maps work, gimmick strategies are more effective for attacking teams. Because as a defender, once you lose the fight, right, once you lose this point, you don't get a fight here again. This point is gone. So if you're trying to use a gimmick strategy as a defender, it's kind of risky because once it gets countered, you just lose the point entirely. Whereas as an attacker, if your gimmick strategy gets shut down, you just switch characters and try again, right? You don't have to live with any losses except for like 30 seconds on the clock. It's not a big deal. Are there any questions about gimmicks? All right. I want to talk about adjusting strategies now. So once you've come up with whatever your strategy is, right, no matter how well you plan, it's really unlikely that you will account for everything in your initial planning. You're gonna miss some stuff that the enemy team might do. And so what you gotta do is you gotta test these strategies out in game and watch back the VODs to assess what changes have been made. You gotta see what went wrong and what you gotta do to fix it. Now, doing this, you might discover that due to a certain counterplay, your strategy is actually a gimmick and doesn't really work that well if they employ the counterplay. You might find, like, say here, they use a sim TP up to this high ground, and you might think and think and think. You might be able to find a counterplay to it. Now, I believe there is a counterplay to that. I don't think that a sim TP is shattering to this strategy by any means, but it does definitely complicate things. But other strategies you might find that with a certain counterplay, it is impossible to counter the counter. But also, when you're adjusting strategies like this, you may find new ways to make your strategy even more effective. You may find that perhaps rather than Reaper holding here, it's actually more optimal for him to hold on this flank and push in with the Ram. Now, that's not necessarily always true, but it can be. If they're playing characters where they can't really contest this high ground in the first place, Reaper's not necessarily needed here anymore. He can be better to pressure his own angle over on this left side by the yellow building. You might find that adjustment by watching back the VOD and thinking about things like this. Any questions about adjustments? All right. So I want to talk about the process of creating a strategy now. We talked about all the things that go into it. Now, how do you make one yourself? So this is my personal process I'm going to outline here. So you might do it a little bit differently, but this is how I personally do it. The first step for me is always to come up with an idea, right? When I started with this strategy here, I had a thought of what if Ramatra were to be able to hold the red building and retreat with a Lifeweaver petal? That was my start of the process. And then, once I have the idea, I go into a custom game and I explore around that point. I experiment. I see, can you actually take the pedal and jump to the other side? Yes, you can. It works just fine. I look around. I assess other ideas. And I just kind of try and see everything from in the game and see if I'm missing anything. You got to think through how the strategy is going to play out. Kind of try and visualize it in your head, how the enemy team is going to respond, and then how you should respond to that. And you're just going to kind of keep on doing this. You're just going to go in here, assess their responses, think about different characters, where they're going to be, what their jobs are, what the counterplays are. And you're going to try and do this until you think that you've thought through every possible scenario. You haven't, and you never will. But do it until you feel pretty good that you've thought through most of it. Then, once you've done all this thinking, done all this planning, write it down. And then communicate it to your teammates. This is for like whole team strategies. If you just have your own personal strategies, you could skip this step. You don't really have to write it down. It's just for yourself. But if you're explaining it to your team, it's good to write it down so you have all the notes organized. So you're not like trying to stumble through like, you do this then, if I remember correctly. You want to have it written down so you have a concrete plan. And then you got to test the strategy and you got to watch back the VOD to reassess it, see if you got to make any adjustments, so on and so forth. So, as far as the main part of the lecture goes, we're finished now, and we'll get into an activity here.
All this just to get counterplayed by a god-given fucking Widow player.
That is true. If you just get headshot by Widow, GG, go next. But any questions from anybody about the whole lecture here before we move on to the last little bit that we're going to do? All right. I will take that as a no. So in that case, then